from another company called PTC, Parametric Technology Corporation, which did more of the sort of industrial side of design work. So anyway, they founded the company and they founded it there, and so it was in sort of suburban Boston for a long time. Over the last few years, Autodesk has moved the office to downtown Boston on the Seaport area, but there still is a large facility of people that are designing and building Revit, even though now it's, of course, all over the world. Structure is a lot in Romania. A lot of the MEP is done over in the UK. But a large part of the foundation of Revit is still developed in the Boston area. You probably are going to be hearing or have already heard Harlem Brum speak, and he's from the Boston area, and you'll see quite a few people. Zach Cron, you may know. He's also from Boston. Lillian Smith, she's here. So there's quite a group of us that were part of that original crew. So this was kind of the housekeeping items, just to let you know that you can get AIA credits for this. And I wasn't sure, there is in the upper right hand, there's a course number. You see there the AIA DB, or DBW session 1.2. And then you all know the synopsis of the Revit warnings and then the learning objectives here. So I'm not quite sure. I was just talking to Clay about the whole process, but I believe that they'll probably explain this a little bit more, the process for getting additional learning units. But hopefully by the end of this presentation, we'll learn how, all about Revit warnings, what they are, and why they're important to the health of the project. We'll understand different sort of categories of warnings, common warnings, calculated warnings, and geometric warnings. And then we'll understand how to potentially prioritize those warnings. Although I'll be the first to say, through this presentation, I did this actually in Australia. Clay was mentioning that the Build conference there. It's not an exact science. So that's why it's good even to have some dialogue. I'll have some different sort of examples of how people are tackling this idea of Revit warnings. Because you'll see, or you'll hear from me, that even from Autodesk, it's not an exact science, that depending on what you're doing, you can have different warnings that maybe have a higher priority than others. So, but hopefully we'll give you some ideas about how to prioritize things. And then also, the idea is that we're going to be talking mostly about Revit and the tools within Revit, but Ideate Software does develop a third-party add-on application that helps you manage warnings. So, toward the ends of the end of the presentation, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about our Ideate Explorer and just how you could use that to fix some warnings. But remember that the fixing of warnings and the things that I'm talking about are universal. It doesn't need a third-party application. You can do this within Revit. But I'm going to talk about why we developed that and why we feel our tools are superior than just sort of the out-of-the-box dialogue from Revit. So first, we're going to start here with some simple, real basic things. What is a Revit warning? Well, sometimes we get from Revit a little notice that says, oh, you've got some issue or some problem, and you basically can just ignore it. And sometimes it's just more of a sort of a help message, if you will. Other times it is a warning and it's going to get logged. So Revit is continually logging these in the background, and basically you can access a particular dialog where you're going to get the list of all of your warnings. So even though they may disappear from our mindset, it's pretty easy to click here. I'm going to show you an example here. Just click OK and keep going. The problem is that these things can, it's kind of like a virus, right? In the sense that they can get out of hand and they can start small, they can start growing more and more. And then I'm going to talk about how, we've really polled a lot of people in this regard, and the fact that these warnings, if you get them, too many warnings in your Revit model, it can really slow performance, it can cause file corruption, there's all kinds of problems that can happen because of that. You can see slow synchronization times and so forth. So, I'm just, like I said, real basic here. I'm going to switch over to Revit here. And let's just say, let's actually do like a real common warning, right? So if I highlight this desk here, I'm just going to go to a copy command, and we'll copy it on top of itself. And sure enough, It's probably hard for you guys to see that, but you get this little thing that says there are identical instances. Okay, great, fine. And you dismiss the dialogue and you keep going. I'm sure we all do that, right? But you kind of forget about it. But one of the problems there is not just the fact that, okay, yeah, there's two things on top of one another, but that can cause inaccurate counts in your schedules. It cause, obviously, performance issues if you have a lot of these things. So the way that you would potentially look at this is you go over to the Manage tab, right? And then under Inquiry, you have Review Revit Warnings. And so this gives you a list. And one of the first things that I find problematic is that it's not a resizable dialogue. So it's kind of a bad, it's hard to sort of understand these things. And then, for instance, if we come down here to, let's say, the one that I was looking for, let's see, duplicate values, why can't I see that? Oh yeah, here, there are identical instances in the same place. And it actually says this will result in double counting in the schedules. But it's kind of hard, like I've got a lot of these warnings and I'm not really sure where these are. I can do a show, but it might be easier contextually, instead of bringing up this sort of overall warnings dialogue, what you can do is you can highlight an area within the canvas, right? So I'm just selecting on a bunch of items. When I do that as a highlight, I get the contextual menu, which says show related warnings. And here I have a much smaller list, and I can actually see that, oh, there's the two furniture or the pieces of furniture. And it's got some information about that. I've got the Revit element ID. The one that was placed just now has a higher ID. So, for instance, if I do say, let's click on that and say show, it's going to, obviously it's already kind of zoomed up in that, but it's going to give me information here, and I can see like what exactly is this thing. And with the Revit dialog, there are some limited sort of actions that I can take. So in this particular case, if I do see that this is a problem, well, you know what? I can go over here and I can say delete checked. But that's not always the right thing, meaning that the higher element ID may not be the one that you want to delete, or it's sort of, you might want to review the information. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So that's just sort of the way that you access some of these. Also, if you just select on, like I've got a tag over here that's outside the room region. So if I select on just a single thing, right, I can go over here and say, also on the contextual tab, show related warnings. And it's interesting because when you're looking at the Revit dialog that lists all the warnings, the actions typically are very limited. Sometimes you can delete, sometimes you can unjoin, but that's about it. But if you're selecting them like one by one or in a context-sensitive way, then they sometimes will give you more information, or I should say more actions that you can do. So in this particular case, you'll notice that it says, move the tag to the room. So if I want to do that, I can select that, and then that moves it back to the centroid of the room, which is kind of nice. So, the way that Revit works, it's a little bit confusing because you've got this overall Revit dialog, but then you've got these contextual menus too. So, basically that's kind of going through there. Oh, you know what? I forgot to hit my timer. I'm going to be off, but well. So, right now, there are currently 915 Revit warnings that are defined within the API, the Application Programming Interface. So, I'm sure Autodesk is, making more of these, but as of right now, with 2020, when you look at the API, what's available, there are 915 of those. So there's quite a few warnings. And the way that this works is that there is a list of the warning within the API, within Revit. It kind of does a lookup of the warning, and then it actually has the text. So, I wanted to highlight here, in the handout that you have in your app, what I've done is I've actually listed all 915 warnings. So you'll see here a complete list of the Revit warnings. And some of them, again, I think it's hard for you guys to see, but they may not make as much sense. So what I'm going to do here is do a Control F if I can. And I'm going to search for performance. Okay, let's go here. What do I do next? Oh, good. Yeah, there we go, thank you. All right. That makes sense. Okay, come on. There we go. All right, that's what I really want, performance failures. Okay, so what they are categorized basically within the API. There are these categories that Autodesk defines, like stairs, rooms, and there is actually one called performance, which I'll talk about in a moment here. But if you look at duplicate instances here, this is the actual warning that's in the API, duplicate instances. But you'll notice that over here in Revit, if we come over to the warnings, and we'll come down here and say that, see, there are identical instances. Notice how there is more sort of text. It says there are identical instances in the same place. That, so it has text, this will result in double counting, and then it has the actual elements themselves. So what it does is it takes that warning, and then it does a sort of a lookup, right? And then it adds some additional text to it. And we'll just see, I'm kind of explaining this just because later on I'm going to talk about these categories and why they may be important. So let's switch back over here to my presentation. So, like I said, all those are identified in your handout, and this is what I meant was when it says it doesn't include the detailed descriptions, because that's sort of internal to Revit. And then I showed you that Revit, or that the warnings can also be reviewed contextually on the canvas. So if you select one element or multiple elements with a box selection, then you're going to be able to see what warnings are in reference to that particular area. You can also export these. If you'll notice the warnings dialog, there's an export here, and it just exports out HTML so that you can have a list, and this is what it looks like, which shows you the warning and it shows you the element IDs. And then another area that you might want to just look at within the user interface of Revit is that under the settings options, if you go to the graphics, it's called alert, but you can set the color of what the warning is going to be so that, for instance, if you magenta or if it's red, you can go ahead and customize that to your standards. Okay, so just to give you kind of a highlight, again, a little bit about the basics of Revit warnings and where they are and how they function. So I'm going to step back a little bit and basically say, well, how did we, as Ideate Software, how did we get to this point, or how did we become so-called experts of Revit warnings? Well, one of the things we decided to do was back in calendar year 2018, or I think it was Revit 2018, so it's always so confusing, calendar year 2017. Autodesk basically exposed the Revit warnings to the API, right? So that meaning that third-party developers or other software companies could take advantage of that information and either write programs, or even if you're doing some stuff in Dynamo, that is available now through the API as of 2018. So we said, well, you know what? This is now available. This is a good project to maybe potentially do a software package that makes it a little bit easier to manage warnings. But before we go down that path, let's do some research. Let's find out if there's this sort of urban legend that warnings were bad and that they really decrease the performance of the Revit model and that you should try to keep them to a minimum. But there wasn't a lot of information out there. And even Autodesk, if you look at I'll show you some examples here in a second, their technical white paper, basically it just says, please, on a regular basis, review and fix warnings. And they don't give you a lot of information. So we really set out to say, was this like I said, an urban legend? Did it really have an impact by being able to sort of fix these warnings on a regular basis? So that's where the genesis of this particular presentation came about, because we were doing a bunch of research on Revit warnings. So, as I said, you can see that's why I have it highlighted there. It wasn't just an urban legend. like the cat in the microwave. I guess that's an urban legend. So what we did is we have a beta group, like Autodesk does, of the beta forum. I'm just curious, actually, how many of you are part of the Revit beta forum for Autodesk? So quite a few. Where they have like the next, they call it the preview release of Revit. You can go there and you can review features that Autodesk is looking at to release in the potentially the next release of Revit. So we have a similar group, right, of our customers. And so what we did is we created a survey, and we basically said, you know what, we have a couple questions, or a few questions here. How much time do you actually spend reviewing and fixing warnings? So it came out, the average was here, 1 to 2 hours per week. I think that's actually kind of light, personally, but that's what we heard overall from about several hundred people. And then this one really surprised me, which was, if you're reviewing and fixing warnings, how many of your projects are continually reviewed or constantly reviewed for warnings and being able to fix those warnings? And the idea is, here is 49%. So what that means is 51% of Revit projects aren't being reviewed for warnings. So that's a little surprising. And just last night at the speaker sponsor function, I was asking some larger firms, just curious, like, what do you think about warnings in the sense of, do you have a zero tolerance warning policy? Or, and so one of the gentlemen said that they allow 1 warning per megabyte. So if it's a 500 megabyte file, it's allowed to have 500 warnings, which I thought was that's an interesting sort of benchmark, if you will. Other ones I've heard on Twitter and social media where people talking back and forth that they have a zero tolerance, like they're absolutely zero warnings, which I think is a little bit strict. And you'll see sometimes the warnings are okay, meaning that you may have overlapping geometry, and that's the way that Revit has created that. For instance, when you have a lot of curtain wall mullions, you'll end up, depending on like how the glass is being designed, you'll have overlapping mullions, and that's just sort of how Revit does it, or how you have to construct the geometry. So yes, it gives you a warning, but it's not necessarily something that you have to fix. So that's why I feel the zero tolerance warning policy is pretty strict, but I did hear that from people. And then another one, these two questions were kind of interesting, is we asked people, okay, so if you are reviewing and fixing your Revit warnings in your projects, so who's responsible for, first of all, reviewing them? Like if you've got a 500 megabyte file and you've got 500 warnings, who's the responsible party? And it tends to be, maybe 1 or 2 people or a select group, probably the BIM management team or maybe the project leads on the project would be responsible for reviewing those warnings. A lot of the larger firms, and maybe some of you are part of that, they'll have a dashboard that maybe actually lists the number of warnings that are within a particular project. So, I can see that was sort of that BIM manager type function. But really, this was interesting, is when we asked, well, okay, there's a select group of people that are responsible for reviewing, but who's responsible for actually fixing the warnings and doing that sort of on a daily basis? And the majority was really, it's over 40%, was everyone. So it's everyone's responsibility. So, that's why when we were thinking about like creating a tool, we wanted to be able to sort of, I hate to use this word, but it makes the most sense, democratize the fact that basically allow it for everyone, or that anyone could have the ability to be able to sort of review and fix the warnings on a sort of easy basis. Okay, so then we asked people, again, this was trying to get at that urban legend, was what are the consequences to your Revit project if you don't fix warnings? Like you just let them, like you saw when I first did that warning and I just ignored it and I just kept going, and yeah, okay, maybe there'll be some problems with the schedule or duplicate counts, but I can handle that, or what other problems may end up happening. So, this is just a small list. This is the one slide. In your handout, I've actually gone through and done, not every comment, right? But I gave a lot more comments of why people, feel that it's important to fix warnings. So, bad model performance, we heard, model crashing, that's always a bad one, right? Slow models, and I thought this was really interesting, the second from the bottom then. The biggest threat is that warnings increase the size of the model and they slow it down. And personally, I haven't seen as much corruption from letting warnings go out of hand, but I know that that is definitely an issue. Again, people have talked about it on the Twitter sphere and so forth. So that is certainly a potential issue. So, think about that for a second. The biggest threat is increase the model size and slow performance. So I kind of went back through multiple presentations that were done in various conferences. And this was prior to Built. You probably all know that it was called the RTC, the Revit Technology Conference. So in Asia, I think it's Australia. Australia, Asia. Back in 2015, a woman, Michelle, did this presentation about, she actually did urban myths. Like, is this a real myth? And she tried to kind of debunk that or either prove the myth. So she did a little thing where basically, and again, probably hard for you to see those numbers, but here was a file that had warnings, and here was the same file that had, we cleaned it up, and there were no Revit warnings. And then she went through and actually did some things like opening the views, doing some manipulations and so forth, and it was significantly faster. So in her conclusion, with that one little area about performance, she confirmed that that was an actual problem, that the number of warnings can definitely impact and slow the model down. So now we said, all right, people are spending time doing warnings. It seems like most people felt like they were an issue, that there was problems, with file corruption and performance of the model. And the fact that, again, with the performance, there were multiple papers out there that said that. People were talking about it on social media. So, we started to look at, okay, can we categorize some of these warnings? Maybe we could rank them. And, are there some that should be ignored or possible? Or are there some that have maybe a higher priority than others? So, again, this was our quest when we were developing this particular application that we have that's dealing with Revit warnings. So I mentioned to you that I actually, since I did used to work at Autodesk, I contacted the team there multiple times, like the QA team, asking them if they had sort of best practices for warnings, or was there a particular warning that they felt was the most critical. And it was hard, and I understand, like I said, it's not an exact science. So, the QA and the product management team was sort of a little bit hesitant to give me any really good information on, like I said, these are the most important things. So, you can kind of glean, I think, some information just from reviewing that warnings list. Because, there are 70 unique warning types for stair and ramps, and there are 38 unique warning types for rooms. So if you look at under rooms, that all the different rooms, categorized like tags outside the room, the geometry is overlapping, the room definition, and so forth. The volumes are not being calculated correctly, and those kinds of things. There's a lot when it comes to rooms. So definitely, and you'll see that there's a performance paper talking about, the fact of trying to fix these room warnings is something that definitely Autodesk recommends. And that's a good, I think, strategy as well. Also, as I already showed you in the handout, I highlighted in blue here, these are the ones that are under the performance category. So Autodesk doesn't basically say that they're going to cause performance problems in so many terms, but they have put them in the API under performance. So I can only, again, glean the fact that these particular warnings are something that is an issue. So, the duplicate instances, sketching is too large, walls overlapping, nested families, unused nested families, large family files. That kind of makes sense. So when you look at some of these, that especially a large family file, it's got a lot of these things. I don't remember if there was an in-place family, because that's not really necessarily a warning per se, but let's see. Yeah, many elements in the family. That's obviously going to cause some performance issues. So, it gives you kind of a good, I think, snapshot of what Autodesk looks at and says, oh, these are potentially performance issues. Now, I mentioned this before. The last technical note that I was able to find online from Autodesk was the 2017, so it's been a few years since they've produced one, does anyone know of a more current one? And this is something that you can basically find either on the forums, or I think it was on Autodesk support at one point. But basically they're talking about things about, again, as an example, use loadable component families, don't use in-place families, or use them sparingly, right? Because what happens is a chair that is placed 100 times as a component, it's really only placed once, and the other 99 are referencing back. An in-place family, let's just say you've made it a chair, and then you copied it 100 times, it's actually 100 times in the model, because there's no type. It's all like basically in that, each one is its own type. So it's not referencing back to the original. So that's a big problem, performance-wise, when it comes to like in-place families or loadable families. So anyway, there was things like that in this technical paper that talk about modeling, and the only thing I could really find, again, was it says here, model economically, and rooms and spaces, promptly resolve warnings about the room boundaries and overlapping elements. Again, that's going to cause some potential performance issues here. So, again, there was no exact answer from Autodesk, except that it's important to regularly review and fix these warnings that you have in your project. Okay, so I already mentioned that the existing Revit dialog, we felt that there were some problems with it. And the biggest thing, I feel like you can't resize it I'll say very easily, you can't resize it at all. And that, again, the view commands, when you say show the element, those work, but anything else, like if I come over here and I actually wanted, you see everything's grayed out, I wanted to come over here and draw a wall or something while I'm actually having these warnings open, or I want to review some information, then basically I'm locked out of it. It's called a modal dialog box. Basically, I have to close this dialog box in order for the commands in Revit to work. So that was kind of a problem, is that you can't have it open while you're working, and that there was no priority ranking of the Revit warnings. So even if you wanted to sort of define your own system of rankings, that wasn't available. There was no searching or filtering. And then, like I mentioned here, that depending on what dialog you used, whether it was the main dialog in Revit or it was one of the contextual dialogs, you sort of have different actions. And the actions that were available were fairly limited, basically, of what you could actually do. So we thought about all those things, or these limitations, when we were sort of designing an application. So this is my sort of add-on part of it. Now, I'm going to jump to fixing the warnings in a moment here and categorizing them, which is really, again, doesn't matter what particular application you have. But I thought, since I'm using Ideate Explorer, I've got some examples that are fixing warnings using Ideate Explorer. I thought I should explain what it is. So we, for many years, at Ideate Software, we've had this product that is a model browser as opposed to a project browser, meaning that it shows every instance of every element in the project, and you can navigate to those elements and be able to select them very easily. So we thought that instead of developing a standalone application that just was like a Revit Warnings manager, that it would be better to integrate an existing tool that we had and use kind of the paradigm of this tool and how it works. So with that, this is the existing interface to Ideate Explorer as far as, when you're sort of navigating to individual elements. And then what we did is we said, all right, we'd like to be able to display the status of the warning, whether it's a, sort of a warning or high-ranked warning. So we have an alert icon where we can specify a particular threshold. So in that example that I talked about where I was talking to the gentleman last night, where he has a 500 megabyte file and he's allowing one warning per megabyte, then you could set that threshold so that if that goes over 500 as the number of warnings you have, that would give you an alert icon. So that was one, and then the ability to rank the warnings by just really sort of 4 categories. High, ranked warning, a medium, a low, and then basically no ranking at all or sort of a hidden warning. Like you just want to, like I was talking about the, if you've got a lot of, let's say, geometry that is overlapping and it's okay, you just might want to hide those particular warnings. So the ability to be able to sort of control that display and be able to filter by the ranking status, and then also to give you a little bit more information about the element. So as I was showing here earlier, if I switch over here and just, again, grab a bunch of stuff here and show related warnings, you'll notice that, I have information in this sense of, it's basically what this is. It's basically category, family, and type. But, and it shows me the Revit element ID. But it doesn't have, for instance, who created that element or when it was last saved in the central model, because that could be important. So we thought it was good to be able to show a little bit more information as well about that element. So like I said, we have the ID, the category, the type and name. We've also included level information, and then who it was created by, and then who it was last updated in the central model, if it's a work shared project. So this particular paradigm of Ideate Explorer seemed to fit pretty well in what we were thinking about for being able to sort of review these warnings. All right, so that's my little spiel. So again, you can use Ideate Explorer and the default Revit Warnings dialog within Revit together, and you can have them both open. And that's one key thing that I mentioned earlier about the Revit, this dialog. Notice in the fact that, again, to do anything, I actually have to close it. And the nice thing is if I do have over here Ideate Explorer open, and that, for instance, whether I'm reviewing elements or I'm switching it to, let's say, warnings, I still can come over here and, draw a wall, or whatever. I can do anything, of course. Hey, that's another warning. Great, they're not visible. But, so the idea that you can interact with it while the dialogue is up, we thought was really key. Okay, so now let's look at categorizing the types of Revit warnings. And again, giving you some recommendations based on our experience and really talking to existing customers, Revit customers, but also Ideate Software customers. In the sense, I was telling you that we did, a lot of the survey for this particular project, and got feedback from people on how they were sort of categorizing and what warnings were important and not. So we've identified 3 main buckets, and when I was looking for pictures, I couldn't find 3 buckets, so there's 4 buckets here. So the buckets of sort of information here, we've got the common Revit warnings, which are going to be identical instance, duplicate marks, duplicate type marks, calculated Revit warnings. So those are things that are Revit is waiting for sort of a calculation to happen, you know, like a drop or a coefficient. A lot of these are obviously MEP type of warnings. And then geometric warnings, these were identified as probably the ones that were, at least from our users, that were the most critical to them was, you know, floors overlapping or geometry overlapping was something that could potentially, you know, really impact the performance of the project, but also impact the quality of the project. As I said, you know, again, none of these are an exact science because sometimes these geometric warnings, if you've got overlaps, that may be okay or it may be acceptable. All right. So let's just look at common warnings, right? So these are typically what we feel things that are not going to impact the performance of the project in a drastic way. Although one of my coworkers, Glennis Patterson, who is our director of Ideate Development, she mentioned to me that there was a customer that she was working with that actually had, I don't know, something like 50,000 duplicate type mark warnings. And that by cleaning that up, that actually did really increase the performance. So I was kind of surprised by that. But I guess maybe it was because it was so large. There was so many of them. There, you know, again, it was in the tens of thousands. So that might have been something that was the issue there. So let's take a look at the first one, which is the duplicate mark. You know, typically, like I said, it's not a big deal. We've all seen this. You know, even when it comes to like doors, you know, door numbering and so forth. You know, that can be an issue if you've got a duplicate mark. But it's basically the mark is on the instance, right, of the element, and it is typically the tag or the number of what that element is. You know, a sequential number. And a lot of times, you know, if you're using Kobe, and show of hands, how many are using Kobe in here? A few, not too many. I think it's interesting, and more obviously in the UK, and we're in Europe, and when I was doing the presentation in Australia, it seems like there were more people that were using Kobe standards. But any classification system, a lot of times they don't, you know, they're not allowing spaces, and they need to be unique numbers. So again, this can be an issue. So what I'm going to do here is just, I've got a little video here, and this is showing, when I start this off, showing how Ideate Explorer works for identifying a particular warning and being able to fix it. I'm going to show you some things in Revit too. So in this particular case, I'll just start this, and you know, if we go to our warnings tab, you see that we've got, you know, duplicate marks on there's 33 elements and 288 elements. So what I can do is highlight all of these elements here, right? And I can basically, when I highlight all of them, the properties palette becomes active. Like I said, you can interact with the elements as you're working. And the easiest thing, I'm just clearing it. Basically, I'm saying I'm not giving it a mark at all. So therefore, it's not a duplicate mark. So one of the things you might want to look at is, okay, first, does it even need a particular number, a unique number? And then the second one is, this is a little bit more problematic if I want to go through and, like this case, say, you know, B3-1-2, because as I change these, I still get this pop-up message because it's looking at all the other ones that haven't been changed yet and saying that they're duplicates. So I would recommend maybe instead of doing it like one by one, is to do it in a schedule, which would be a lot easier, or to use another application. I'm sure a lot of us have applications that export out to Excel, and then you can actually update all of the the mark very easly and update that so you don't get those warnings. So let's just say, as an example, you did export that out to some, you know, some program that allows you to, using a program that allows you to export to Excel, even Dynamo, and then update the mark, and then you'd import that back, and then you'd review the warnings to make sure that, okay, that did fix those, you know, 20,000 mark warnings that I had. So that's a way to be able to review and fix those. Now, the second thing is there's, I mentioned that there's the numbering sequence on the individual instance itself, but then there's also the type mark. And this is also something that typically, probably won't impact the performance that much. That's why, like I said, these are common warnings. But because we're actually dealing with the type, instead of using Ideate Explorer, maybe again, a system where you're exporting it out. We have a product called BIMlink, but like I said, there are lots of different products that allow you to export out to Excel and be able to update that information in Excel, or maybe use a schedule to update the information. It is probably a lot easier, but at least this is flagging that particular warning for you. Now this one we've already talked about, the identical instances. So, this can definitely impact the performance of a project. And you want to make sure that, and as well as, like I said, schedule counts too. You want to make sure that these are properly reviewed and the ones that are unnecessary removed from your project. So in this particular case, what I've done here is, I mentioned that, we can color code it into that. Red is a high-ranked warning, green is a low-ranked warning, yellow is medium. And so, in this particular case, you'll notice that I highlighted this here because the first one actually has Kobe data. And the second one was placed on top of it, and it was a mistake. So remember earlier when I talked about the idea that you can't always go by the element ID, because you want to make sure that you're reviewing both pieces of information. Yeah?
Can you isolate it by which one has the tag applied to it? Because that's the most important thing for us.
By a tag applied to it. You mean like a particular parameter?
No, like you've got two tables there, two shares in the room. And someone has placed the correct one and placed a identical one in the same spot. If one of them is tagged, right? In this dialog box, can you just isolate which one's not tagged and get rid of that one?
Yes. So that is one of the things that with I should say within Revit itself, you can review the information, but also, I'll just show here, if I switch over here to Revit, and if I actually go to Explore, what I can do is look at, let's say, and I'm trying to think of a good example, let's just say doors, and I'll select all of those, and say none. Yeah, we know. We're in the middle of the command here. All right, so let's select doors. And one of the things that we can query with using this tool on a particular property. So let's see. You can see that there, based on the Kobe tag number, like in this case, there are 67. They're all blank that I just happen to pick. But there are any particular property that I have that say, let's see, maybe a good example. Let's see, Kobe, I was trying to think of description. This is the shared, of course, all the data is blank. Isn't that wonderful? Okay, great. Assembly description. I'm just querying this based on some particular property, either like whether it was tagged or what the property that might be tagged. Like in this case, I said assembly description. So that there are 7 that are blank. There are 5 that have exterior glazed doors. There are 44 that have interior, 2 that have overhead. So what I can do is then select on those that are blank, select those, and then I have those particular selections. Then I can come over here and basically look at that, and then decide that, okay, if I'm highlighting on that, right, in this case there is not a duplicate warning, but if there was, then I could isolate that particular warning. So using Explorer, you can search for property information or sort of a query for any of the information on the element itself.
Well, I don't work for Ideate, but one easy way to make sure that you receive the right identical instance is to use smart delete tool, and you can see that a tag is also going to be deleted. When you delete that piece of delete of whatever, then you don't delete that, and then you delete that.
Thank you very much. And again, that's not a plant at all.
I'll just mention another way.
Yeah.
We do as well, instead of the smart delete, you can create a schedule, and then filter by the line parameters, select all the people.
That's a good way too, as well. Yeah. So yeah, the schedules are really helpful for doing those kinds of things. And you know, in my little video here, let me go back here just a second. I don't know if you guys noticed, I had to point this out. Yeah. So this one that has the Kobe data, of course, it was created by George Michael, Wham Architects, whereas the one that's bad is Richard Taylor. So. And then, let's just say we go back to, go here to Ideate Explorer. I'm going to come over here to the warnings again, and say, and there are identical instances. So there's 75 elements that are in the same place. And so a lot of these are these rectangular instances of the mullions, which I said are potentially okay. What we've done is we've added something that basically people were asking us to like have fixes built into Explorer, but you notice that like with so many things, as we just talked about, you know, there's like 3 different ways to do it, and you know typically the automatic fix is not the best thing because you know there's just so many nuances, right? But we did add this based on customer request. So when this first was introduced last year, we just had showing you the warnings. Now there's a few that have a fix. In this particular case, you can see that I can right click and I can say, if I know that the lower Revit element ID numbers, which were the originals, right? Or I want to remove all the latest, which are the most recent element IDs. So if I said, well, I knew this was a mistake based on that person that did it, I want to basically, retain the originals instead. You'll notice here that it basically says, well, there are 64, it did it all together, all of them, basically on the top level category. So it did the window mullions as well as the pieces of furniture. But I may not want both of those. So what I'm going to do here is hit cancel, and then go over to Explore, and in the current selection here, let's go to the entire project and go back here to the current selection, you can see that I have the 64 curtain mullions and the 11 pieces of furniture. And these are the originals. So I can untick the 64 curtain panels, and then I can hit delete here, and that's going to delete just the furniture and keep the curtain mullions basically where they are. It's not going to delete those, because some of those may be necessary. So that's a way for me to use some of the tools within Ideate Explorer to be able to sort of highlight some issues. Like I can do kind of a global issue. I'm going to remove keep all the originals, remove the ones that are the duplicate that were based on the element ID, the later ones. But then go back and kind of filter out certain ones that maybe I don't want to delete or remove. Okay. And let's see where I'm at here. Too many screens open. Okay, the next sort of bucket of information, or bucket of sort of categorizing these things, is called calculated warnings. So this is something that I was telling you about, like, okay, Revit's trying to figure out like the room volume, and maybe there's an error because the ceiling is not properly enclosed, and so it can't calculate the volume of the room. Or maybe the coefficient is not defined based on the ASHRAE standards for the MEP system. So Revit's kind of sitting there in the background trying to figure out these things. The first thing, or the tip, if you will, is do you even need the calculation? So my example of the room volume, maybe you don't even need that, or you're not even calculating room volume, so you can go ahead and turn that off, and that's going to then obviously remove that particular warning because it's not calculating it in the background. So, my first tidbit or tip basically is to say, if you're getting a calculated warning, is it something within Revit that potentially you could even turn off so it's not even calculating it per se? So, and I have an example of that. So in this case, I go through and I look at the warnings here, and basically, it says there's no loss defined, because it's actually looking for an ASHRAE table that's not there, that can't be found. So we're going to look at that element. And again, the nice thing is you can sort of isolate the information. You can use all the tools in Revit to do a section box and say, okay, well, what am I exactly looking at? And what am I reviewing, basically? So in this case, as I get the right view, it's saying that the loss method, there are different ways to calculate that. So you could say not defined. That might be a way to quickly fix that warning. Or instead of like looking at the ASHRAE tables, I'm just going to basically specify a particular coefficient. And so by specifying the coefficient as opposed to looking at the table, then that eliminates that particular warning. And then I can say, okay, now I've updated that, and then that warning's no longer there. So that, again, is a good tip to think about, especially if you've got, let's say, multiple files where you've got information from an MEP file. Another question I think in Australia people asked me was about, if you're the architect and you notice like the MEP or the structural has a lot of warnings, would you go and clean up their models? I would recommend against that. As you see, there's some laughter. Because I mean, it just would be, I don't think the performance of like, if you're linking it in is really that great. Again, this is my opinion, that you're really linking in more of the geometry. And so yeah, it may have a lot of warnings, but the best thing would be to go back to that individual company, I think, and ask them to like review the warnings, maybe get those down to a lower warning count, and then be able to give them the file. But if you do think that it's really impacting the performance, you could go in and sort of wipe out some of those warnings by doing some of these things. But it's probably not worth the time and effort. And then this was one, the next sort of category was, we heard quite a bit, as I was mentioning to you, from our beta panel, that this could really impact the performance and the construction of the models with these geometric warnings. What's interesting is when you do like a wall on top of a wall, it is an overlap warning. It's not a identical instances warning, even though they're right on top of one another. Because again, sometimes the way you're, as you all know probably, as you're constructing walls, you've got to do some sort of fake geometry sometimes, and they have to overlap. So, some of these may, again, be okay. You see here, floor overlaps, misses the target, or, you've got intersection failures and so forth. So let's take a look at this. And, oh, there's the right. So, again, the main thing here is that second bullet point is I think it could be incorrect quantity, like you've got floors overlapping, and you're doing like quantity takeoff. That could impact the quantity that you're reviewing. But also, it says unexpected conditions in 3D views. It could occur if they're inadvertently hosted to the wrong part. So there's a lot of problems with these geometric warnings. So in this case, I've got an example here where I'm just showing how you can right-click on the warnings, which is I've got geometric warnings in the walls, the floors, and I'm going to set the ranking to a high ranking, and then just refresh the list. And so now I know that I have a high ranking, and I want to be able to review that first. So it kind of gives me a priority. And then again, another nice thing is I'm highlighting these two elements, and because we have the non-modal dialog, I can go to any of the viewing commands, and I can isolate the view or isolate the elements. So when I isolate the elements, I can see them a lot easier. And then just with Revit, just go ahead and fix that by bringing that wall, the floor system back so that it's no longer conflicting and overlapping. And then, showing that warning goes away, and then I can reset the temporary height isolate. So using all those, like, isolate, temporary height isolate, the section box, I use that a lot when I select something, is really nice. Actually, that's probably one of my favorite tools in Revit now, is being able to just select on anything. Like in the case of, if I come over here to the entire project, and I'll just say, you know what, let's go down here to, like, just to show you how this works, doors, I'll just say that, there's an overhead door here or something, select on it, and then you go use this 3D selection, and what it will do then is go ahead and build that. So it builds a section box right around that element that or number of elements you selected. So it takes the, basically the boundaries of the elements or the extents of the elements you selected and builds a selection box for you.
Question for you.
Yeah.
So when you're ranking the different warnings, is that something that is it just within your own tool, or is it within a project, or can you share it between people somehow?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question, if people didn't hear it, was, okay, once you have a warnings ranking, can you share it, or is it like per project, or is it for standards? So, I didn't want to talk too much about our solution, right? I probably did a little bit more. But we do have the ability within Ideate Explorer to have a rankings file, and you can load the rankings file in. So there's a default, or basically you can set your company or your firm's standards. Then that becomes your standard, and then for each individual project, you might want to modify or tweak it a bit, or you can only use the company standard as an example. So it's flexible in the sense of how you decide to use it. So in this case, if I go over to my settings here, you'll notice that I have here the default. So if I say browse, here's the default metrics that we supply. Now, in our particular case, with the Ideate Explorer out of the box, we only have one default rankings file that we've taken a stab at about 60 or 70 of what we feel are the most common or the most critical warnings. And we've ranked them as high, medium, and low. But as I said, that's 75 out of 915. So there's a lot more. And in fact, if you come over here and you say, let's do browse, there should be here. Oops. Oh, come on. Not all of them. I'm browsing the wrong location. There we go. So this one here, you should see when I, the wrong custom, sorry, the wrong one. Open. I thought it would, should actually say that. Let me make sure that I'm doing the right one here. Oh, that's the one. Import. So, I wanted just to show you that there's a dialog that comes up. That's the one. That basically says, okay, all 915 warnings have now been defined. Now, they're not ranked, but they've been defined. So you can now review, if I say close, in this dialog, you now have the ability to review all 915. That doesn't mean that they're in this project, right? But you have the ability to then start saying what their rank's going to be. If you want to say that that one's a low, or this one's going to be a high rank warning, then you can then save that off, and then I would export it to a particular file. But as I mentioned, if you come over here, say restore defaults, and then import, the one that's the default has then, you'll see, there's only 58 that we've defined. And you'll see that they've been categorized by the low, medium, or high ranking. That we've, again, based on experience, based on information coming from some of our customers. And I tried to actually, for this presentation, get some ranking files from different customers, but it's kind of hard, it's proprietary information to a lot of firms. But what's interesting is, some of the firms were telling me that they had a rankings file based on production drawings, right? There were certain warnings that they felt were higher value when you're trying to create a construction document set, versus if you're doing just modeling, there was a different rankings file. Like, to me, that seems kind of the same, but I thought it was interesting that they had different rankings files based on different methods of what the model was going to be used for.
Question,
Yeah.
can you filter out, families that you don't care? So one of the things, we use APL as a digital layout. So we get hundreds of duplicate instances because we have multiple points in families with different descriptions. So when the layout team goes to lay out the job, the description tells them exactly what that point does. Well, the problem is now we have all these duplicate instances that it's hard for us to find legit problems, like two lights on top of each other. So my question, can we filter by family to ignore those?
It may not be necessarily by a family. I mean, you certainly could, like in this case, I'm just trying to think of highlighted walls, overlap. You could review that information. You could search on, let's say, floors, right? And so you could find the one you're looking for. Those are the only ones that, there were multiple things that had overlapping, but these were the only ones with floors, right? Then I could say those two elements, let's take that particular one here and just hide that. So now that's not going to be, when I hide it, it's not going to list in my warnings. So if I come over here to now clear that, I now have 232, there was 233 before. So I could potentially filter based on, like, say, the family, maybe not a family filter, but I could type in the word, there's some text, filter on that, and then hide those so they're not part of my overall warnings metric, if you want to call it that. So that might be the way that I would classify that, or solve that particular question. All right, getting down in my photos here, my timer here. So let's just come over to my presentation here. Yeah, oh, sorry.
Yeah, I have two quick questions. First one is, where did you get the list of all the different possible warnings?
That list came from the Revit API. And so it was an XML, a XAML file that basically was exported out from the Revit API. And I just went through and just grabbed all of the list in an Excel table, all of the possible warnings. That's how I got it.
Thank you. Second question is if you ignore the warning category. So with Revit, one of the problems is if it's a warning, you can't just say this is not really a warning. I'll give you a concrete example. Sometimes you draw detailed items based on CAD files, and there's a warning that says slightly off axis.
Yep, I'm very familiar with that.
You know, and you put a dimension or angular dimension line, and it looks fine. If you narrow it down to the 7th decimal, you realize that's 89.998 degrees, right? Is there a way to ignore this to say that, you know, this is still not worth fixing this, but you just don't want it as one? Because sometimes with room separation lines or space separation lines, you might have hundreds and thousands of these.
Right. Well, yeah, that's what I was, showing earlier. At least I think the answer to the question is if you want to ignore a particular warning, let's switch back over here to Revit. And so, like in this case, a tag is outside of its region, right? I don't care about that. I can just hide that. So right now, you'll notice that the warning count is 232. If I hide those warnings, right, it's now gone down to 220. So it's just, and then I can filter, like right now, I can say, well, you know what warnings have I hidden? And so it's going to show me, remember there was the floor slab that we did, as well as the tag outside of its region. Or I can filter by things that I've defined as high rank, medium, low. So we do have the ability to hide a particular warning. And like I was saying, to isolate that, right now the only way I can do is like search by the the name, like if it contains concrete, or if it contains, like in the case, maybe axis, AXIS, because it's axis off, slightly off. You could search for those and then hide those.
But it hides it in this interface, it doesn't remove the warning from the model.
It doesn't remove it from the model, no. Yeah, that's a good question. So if, right now, like even with Ideate Explorer, we're just hiding it. We're not removing it. We're not saying to Revit, this actually is not a warning. And that is something that several of our customers have asked about. And I think that might be something we're going to try to potentially look at. I don't know if it's even possible for the API.
And also, it only hides it in your session. It doesn't hide it for anybody else in your team.
That is
It's not
correct.
mutually
That is correct.
interactive.
So that's a big deal. I mean, that is, you're not like globally setting it to say, all right, these warnings, like prefacing it beforehand, these warnings that are slightly off axis, as a global warning setting, I'm not going to worry about that. So that is another nice potential feature that could be developed.
Excuse me. So is there a way to export all this data into an Excel sheet or something that lets your warning plus element ID or into the category that you have to list?
Well, I'm going to give you two answers to that. So the first one is in Revit, as I mentioned at the very beginning, if you come over here to the warnings dialog, right, you can export out, which is HTML, right? But then, if you're using Ideate Explorer, all right, and you look at the warnings here, all right, you can now say, I want to go and view the warnings details. And actually what we've got right now, this is doing the way we've implemented this first pass, and we want to make sure, we want to refine this a little bit. But right now, it's getting all the warnings in the project. So you'll notice that even though I was only listing like 2 right there, or I had a subset, it is getting all the warnings. With its description and you'll see here the warning type, the element ID, and then I can export this. And I can export it to an XLS file directly. So you can export the warnings, but we're trying to get a little bit better where you can sort of filter out exactly which warnings you want to export to Excel or to some other format. Okay. So this was again, the geometric warnings. In this particular case, there's a couple beams where the warning is that they're connected, or that they're overlapping. Let me put the exact one. Oh yeah, they're joined, but they are joined, but they're not connected. So in this particular case, that may be an expansion joint, which is okay. So here's one of those things that you might want to look at and say, all right, well, is that supposed to be an expansion joint? Or are those 2 beams actually supposed to physically connect? So in this particular case, just to show you this, I just isolated it as in a plan view. And then I decided okay, that's not an expansion joint. I actually want to drag that and connect those 2 together. And by doing that, that will remove that warning. But here's a good example of maybe that particular warning might have been okay. I think I'm just about out of my time here.
Richard, can I ask you a question related to the slightly off-axis one?
Yes.
What category do you think that fits in based off of your survey in terms of model performance?
You know, that is a good question. Let me see.
I can't search your handout
Yeah.
on the app, so that's why I'm asking. It's hard to find where that one is.
Okay, slightly, panel slightly malformed. So right now, that is, let's do this.
Maybe try axis, yeah.
Because I don't know off the top of my head.
Because that one we get a lot of. When you automatically place area boundaries or room boundaries off of CAD, because you can do that with Dynamo, you get a lot of those and how critical is it to fix them?
Yeah, so this is, I'm assuming it's probably it's under general failures. I'm thinking it's converting old access to normal. I'm
Okay.
thinking that, like I said, some of these, the warnings themselves aren't the most descriptive.
Yeah.
And so that's where you kind of need a programmer, like one of our programmers, when I was talking about like the API and actually how it's grabbing the information from the API to get the descriptions. I was hoping to have the descriptions, but I couldn't access them very easily. So that's probably the one under general failures.
I'll say from experience, very, very big. It depends on what it is, but I've had like a master planning project over like a 15-acre site, and we used the civil to generate the roads and things. And once we cleaned it up, it was like going from, walking to running.
Okay. And it's probably similar to the quantity, right? So just like you said, the duplicate mark value
Yeah.
ones, if there's 20,000 of them, obviously it's gonna make a difference. So if
Exactly.
there's-
Quantity
yeah.
does matter. If there are 5 of them,
Yeah.
or if there's 500, then it makes a difference. So
Okay.
unfortunately, I know my time is just about, I'm keeping you from lunch, so real quick summary is just the fact that, all these warning things, hopefully you take away, it's not an exact science. I wish at one of my other presentations, people were like, I came here to learn exactly which warning is going to be the right one that I need to fix. And I'm like, I'm sorry, it's not an exact science, but hopefully we'll give you some, you've gotten some guidelines as to what may be some potential problems and why it's important to fix them. And like I said, no matter what tool you use, whether you're using Revit or you're using another third-party package to review, it's important to review and fix those warnings. And I like this one, more of the comments from people is this one I highlighted, is if you have excessive warnings, it looks like you don't know what you're doing. So I thought that was a great summary and sort of why we're really reviewing these warnings in Revit and trying to keep them down to a minimum. Okay, so a couple things, just housekeeping before you run to lunch. Thank you very much. As I mentioned,